All right, this is episode 3 of True Stories and Other Damage. And today I'm sitting with Jason Davis, Sandan in Danzanryu Jiu-Jitsu, doctor of something or other, and editor of the Ki Echo. Welcome, Jason.
Yeah, thank you. It's a doctorate of education.
It's all the same to me. Yeah. I'm going to get a doctorate from the internet, but that's only $50, so a little different than what you did. So let's start out with who are you, Jason?
I am a married father of 3 who has about 20 years of eclectic martial arts experience, and I have done over 20 years of support of technology in higher education, and very actively running a jiu-jitsu class at the college as well, and through all in on getting involved in the AJJF, currently editor of the Ki Echo and also the regional manager for the Midwest.
Awesome. And the AJJF is the American Judo and Jiu-Jitsu Federation, a Danzanryu Jiu-Jitsu national organization that Jason and I both belong to. So where did you grow up at, Jason? Who were you before you did jiu-jitsu?
Mostly grew up in a place called Independence, Minnesota, which is a township. There's not even a gas station there when I was growing up. I am the youngest of 8 kids and grew up on a subsistence hobby farm, which meant that we did like 2 acres of vegetable gardening and had a couple hundred sheep and 30 horses and countless numbers of chickens and so on and so forth. And maybe someday in a later episode we'll circle back and get some of the stories from when you grew up there. Because there are some doozies, especially from the Independence, Cotton Canyon area. But let's focus now on when did you start doing Danzanryu Jiu-Jitsu? I started working out with Ward Melanich and Son Wessler back in about 1992.
And where was the dojo located at that time?
At that time, it was out in Lakeside, which is a suburb of Duluth, Minnesota, and it was in Ward's 3-car garage.
Nice. And just tell me a little bit about what it was like starting down. What brought you in there?
My roommate at the time, Kurt Fernandez, had seen, I think in the yellow pages in the phone book, an advertisement, and he called and left a voicemail asking, "Is this that martial art that Batman does?" And Ward or Son called him back and said they weren't sure how to answer that question, but this is jiu-jitsu and you're welcome to come check it out. And within a week after him going there, another roommate, Ryan Jader, and myself accompanied him, and the 3 of us progressed all the way to green belt together before Ryan moved away, and then Kurt and I got our brown belts together. And then I went back to grad school, got married, had 3 kids, and Kurt proceeded to get his NEET on. And it wasn't until something like 12 years later that I came back and progressed from my brown belt up to my current rank, which is Sandan.
So you took a 12-year gap in there.
Yep.
What happened there?
A master's degree, a doctorate, 3 kids, getting a career started and going during that whole time, because I did my graduate work while I was working full-time as well. And I dabbled in things like Tung Sudo during that time. Because I was able to set up or get into a class where I could bring my kids into class with me from when they were like 4 and 6 and 8 years old. So I did do a couple of years of Tung Sudo with a sensei named John Kadrowski, who strangely enough now also is a black belt in Tung Sudo. In Danzanryu. And
what is Tung Sudo?
Tung Sudo is it's a Korean art, and I think it's probably got its roots in Shotokan karate, but it's got some of the higher and spinnier kicks like Taekwondo too. It was a lot of fun to work with.
But primarily a striking
Mostly a striking style, yeah.
And for those people who haven't worked out with you or done a drill that we do where you're attacked by all of your dojo mates to see how well you are moving through a crowd and utilizing, you have a great double lunging jump kick.
Yeah,
I think now would be a good time to describe you also. Like, what size are you?
I'm 6'3", about 235 pounds.
Yeah. And also proud of his Viking heritage, which I can attest to while being slammed on the ground and strangled unconscious.
Yeah, I actually, that's a pretty keen interest of mine. I have my family tree back to 1100 AD on my biological father's side.
So a warrior class going back to 1100 AD is a nice place to start a martial arts career.
Sure.
So when you and Kurt and Ryan were initially doing jiu-jitsu and you were all in your early 20s, what at that time the Kiryukan had a pretty active judo team as well.
Yeah, we did. We first of all, there weren't a lot of high-ranking students during those years, and so when the three of us got to green belt, there was an additional Friday night class added for advanced jiu-jitsu, and it was for green belts and up, and it was specifically for us. And so we did 3 nights a week of Danzanryu, 1 night a week of judo, and then on many Saturdays we would travel somewhere to compete in judo tournaments as the Duluth Judo Club, which has been around since the early 1960s and is something that Ward inherited. At that time, Roger Jensen was the sensei of Duluth Judo Club, and he was actively teaching us on Thursday nights judo, and Ward and San were learning judo from him at that same time. Ward eventually got his shodan in judo and took over the club when Roger retired from doing that.
So what was your experience doing Danzanryu, which is primarily a kata-based traditional martial art, and judo simultaneously?
Well, the first article that I ever wrote was an article that got published in the Ki-ai Echo back in 1996, believe it or not. And I also published a companion piece in the Minnesota Judo News, which was a magazine down in the Twin Cities at that time. I forget the title, but it was something to the effect of how judo and jiu-jitsu can complement one another, learning them simultaneously. And to me, learning how to make your jiu-jitsu techniques work against somebody who was not cooperative really refined the ability to find that tipping point that you're looking for every time you do the kata. It added new variables, and it narrowed down your opportunity for error. It narrowed down how precise you needed to be in order to make your technique work, and it was a really good experience for me. It took me several tournaments before I got an ippon throw in judo. It was much easier to knock somebody down and choke them out or hold them down for 30 seconds, whatever it was at that time.
Because you grew up on a farm and you're...
Yeah, I probably, when we sheared 200 sheep, I probably, knocked them down and held them long enough to get sheared many, many times.
Yeah, and I can attest to that feeling as well. You've shorn me, ripped out chunks of my beard, which I did not appreciate. But that's the cost of doing judo with the Viking savages. So there's a huge debate today, ever since mixed martial arts hit the scene, about the efficacy of traditional martial arts. And I would argue in the beginning of the mixed martial arts craze and the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, there was a huge poo-pooing of the traditional martial arts as ineffective because they hadn't practiced their kata in a randori situation. And now, as mixed martial arts has been around for obviously thousands of years, but in this iteration, 20 or 30 years, we're starting to see those traditional martial arts come back into full combat style as those techniques have value and are being practiced in randori situations. Those traditional martial arts are starting to resurface, I would argue, as refined and improved from a time period where they weren't used for live combat. What was your experience like doing Danzanryu along with judo as you did kata-based martial arts with people who weren't doing judo as well?
So one other martial arts experience I had prior to starting jiu-jitsu and judo with Ward and San was I had 3 years of Shotokan karate, which I started when I started college. And there I also did sparring, and I did spar in one tournament in Tang Sudo. So I've sparred in points fighting tournaments, and where you're supposed to have like quarter contact, things like that. And I enjoyed doing it, but it wasn't as realistic as judo, obviously. Judo is 100% full force within the set of variables that the rules give you. So you don't have any striking like you do in MMA, but everything else that you're doing is 100% full force. And I just don't think there's a way to substitute that in a kata environment. You got to get that feeling of what's it like to have somebody actively combating against me and not letting me do my techniques, but I still have to make them work somehow. I think that I always talk to my students in my dojo, and I tell them, if you think about stretching your arms out to the right and to the left as far as you can, and saying this is a continuum of all the variables that could be in a self-defense situation, and then I shrink that continuum down and say, and here's what judo looks like, and it's something like a quarter of that continuum, and then I shift my shortened continuum to the right, and I say this is what boxing is, and then I go to encapsulate both of those shortened continuums and say this is kind of what MMA looks like, and then I put my hands almost together to the tiniest part of that continuum that there is, and I say this is what we're thinking about today when we do Katate Tori Ichi, our first technique on the Katate Hizushi Ichi, single hand escape first, the very first Uwari technique that they're learning. We're going to have like 4 variables. I'm going to be very prescriptive to you. It's no less effective than everything else in that continuum. We're just putting all those variables to the side so that we can really do a couple of things incredibly well eventually after we've practiced them. And I think that's where the value is in kata and kata-based martial arts. If you haven't worked the footwork and you haven't worked the how do I move my hips and all those kinds of things, then when you jump right into the combat phase with all those variables, you're not going to have the right kind of structure to do it perfect. If you think about Tiger Woods, when he was at the height of his game, he realized there were some mechanics in his swing that weren't working right. He totally blew up his swing and went back to basics. He went basically back to kata, perfected his kata, and then came back and won more masters. And so if you're serious about your craft, you have to do kata. If you're serious about your craft, you have to put it to the test and do the competitions as well.
And I always think that there's a discrepancy when people are thinking about, when I'm saying practice it in a randori situation, I'm not saying you have to do MMA to be a real martial artist. And I'm not saying you have to win a judo competition. For myself, I've done 1 judo contest and maybe gone to 10 judo classes. Being a Danzanryu Shodan first degree black belt, my judo is terrible. At the same time, it's something that I keep in my mind when I'm practicing my kata, and it's something that I do try and practice when I have some free time.
Yeah, and I think that just having the judo experience, however limited it is, and also even just doing the point fighting experience with striking gives you a sense of the timing around striking and blocking and everything that you don't get. Ideally, should we all do a kickboxing match, a boxing match, an MMA fight, and a judo match? Yeah, probably every martial artist should do a full contact competition across 2 or 3 disciplines to understand what that looks like and feels like. Most of my experience, that was, everything that was full speed was judo, and we did lots of judo tournaments, and I haven't done them in these last 10 years since I came back. I've done some judo classes and I've done some randori and played around, but I haven't gone back and competed in any tournaments or seriously attended judo classes. But was that experience a grounding force in everything I'm doing now? Absolutely. And
I'm going to argue it's a conversation we're going to keep having for a long time, especially as we start to get older. I'm 42. You're
46.
So, and our instructors are under 60. We'll see what happens in 10 or 15 years. Right now, our instructor is still both schooling people in judo on a regular basis.
Absolutely.
Wrestling and running around the mat.
And we have and I helped for about 7 or 8 years. I assisted Son Wessler teaching the kids judo club, and all three of my daughters went through that club and competed in tournaments. And so I've been on the coaching side of judo too and seen what that looks like. And it was a blast. My daughters all had a great time with it. There's nothing more fun than seeing them throw or hold down some boy much bigger than them. And there's no substitute for those kinds of experiences.
Yeah, and in today's world, having children, and particularly daughters, being able to defend themselves seems like a good use of your time as a parent.
Yeah.
But on this, just to kind of tie up this topic a little bit, I think it's important to have this conversation about doing randori or judo or live practice to add to your kata, not as a criticism of anything, but as a way to maintain the viability of Danzanryu Jiu-Jitsu. So I want to be able to keep having this conversation in this format where we can have a longer conversation. So it's not just, you don't do judo, you suck. Because then under those metrics, I don't do judo. So I can't,
Sure.
I guess I would have to criticize myself there as well. And we could always do more, but that's not today probably. So let's talk about the rank structure for Danzanryu Jiu-Jitsu for our dojo in particular. So when you came back for this second round, you were a Q rank, which is below black belt.
Right.
What was your testing like up until where you're at now?
So I was a San Q, which meant that I was the lowest level of brown belt, and there's 2 levels of brown belt beyond that before you're eligible to test for Shodan or black belt. And the week I came back, we used to have a winter camp in Duluth, and there was a winter camp, and a couple of professors came to teach. They saw my brown belt, and they assumed that I was ready to do lots of brown belt techniques all the way up to the highest level of brown belt. And I literally had been out of the system for over 12 years. But one thing that I want to mention is I had kept my notebook. And before I showed up for class, I read my notebook for 2 weeks. And I remembered most of the techniques. And somehow or another, I was able to perform like a brown belt at that camp, which felt really good. So beyond that, what happened next was Ward and San were really intense about test preparation for me. I was the first person in a while who was going to progress towards Shodan, so I got a lot of individual attention. Since then, we've had a lot more people come up, including yourself, which is a really good, vibrant feel for the dojo. I don't know what else to say about it except that every test that I took, they tried to create the pressure and the sensibility as though it was a Shodan exam.
Where did you take your first test at?
My Shodan exam?
Yeah.
In Chicago. At Thornton, I think.
Excellent. And what does a test for Danzanryu Dan ranks look like?
You do 6 techniques from each of several lists that are representative kind of the whole list, and most lists are somewhere between 20 and 35 techniques. When you get up to some of the higher lists, you might do a few more techniques. I think if I remember correctly, there are 187 techniques you need to have in your mind as Shodan. You're not going to do all of them, but from that, you're going to get a large subset. If you fail one technique on any list, you might still pass the test. If you fail 2 techniques from any given list, you're immediately done with the test. And if I remember correctly, you can't fail more than 5 techniques across all lists, or you're out. It's 3 higher ranking black belts, at least 2 levels above what you're testing for, none of whom are your sensei. And the way the Kyoryunikon does it, we don't allow you to test in your home state. You got to travel to test so that there's no even appearance of a conflict of interest, which is something that I think is good.
Yeah, I've never trained somewhere where I felt as if I earned my rank as much as training at the Kyoryunikon, and that's something. Those extra steps are something that I appreciate.
Yeah.
So, you took your first degree black belt test. There's a mandatory 2-year timing grade before a second degree black belt test. Any changes between those 2 things for you?
Well, one big thing was about a year after I got my Shodan, my first degree black belt, I started my own dojo. And I did it at the college, and I did it just as a sport club to start with. You had to get 4 people to sign up on a charter, and that was all it took. And the 4 people who filled out the charter for me never even showed up for class. That was kind of a side story. But in any event, I had some students wander in and start working out with me. And I had tried to get it set up as a credit course, but there were no takers. I just couldn't get my foot in the door. And then one day, the head of the Applied Human Sciences department came walking down the hallway and saw us working out and said, "Hey, this would be a really cool class. You ever think about doing this as a class?" And so a couple of years after the club started, it became a class. And so for the last 6 years, I've had somewhere between 25 and 30 students on the mat on a regular basis, often 20 brand new white belts every semester, and a bunch of students who are returning and helping me teach and learning and progressing.
What's that like, teaching Danzanryu Jiu-Jitsu in the university setting?
It's interesting. There are some challenges. One challenge is that students are always leaving, or their studies are becoming such a difficult part of their life that they're just not giving the time to jiu-jitsu anymore. Also, having 20 new white belts every semester, I can honestly say 6 years of 20 new white belts every 4 months, I probably have seen every kind of how to do a technique wrong as a white belt, how to be deathly afraid of the first front roll, and almost, I'd say I probably have had less than one of those students drop the class on average any given semester. And even the people who are least athletically capable of progressing are able to learn all the basics and get to a gold belt within that 4-month period, and it's really rewarding for them.
Yeah, and I've been there with you since your charter times, through even you letting me come in and help you demonstrate some stuff as I prepare for my knee-down test. And it's just a different environment having 20 brand new 18 to 20-year-olds, no idea what's going on with this Danzanryu stuff, and we're whipping each other around by belts around our neck and stuff. It's an interesting, definitely a much different dynamic than it is at the dojo that we train at.
Yeah, and our dojo that where we train, on any given night, we might have somewhere between 5 and 7 black belts from Shodan all the way up through Rokudan. And so there are many nights that there might be less cues than there are dans there, and that's pretty interesting. When it's just me teaching on my mat, I might have 20 white belts and a couple of gold, blue, and green belts, and that's it. And so I'm running them in lines, and I'm also finding nice shortcuts where I can do drills and things where they're all working at once, so they're not waiting for their turn to roll down the mat. And the other thing that I've done is a lot of active learning stuff, where you start to try to think about how you get a student to improve their understanding. This is an article waiting for me to write for the Kyoto about Bloom's taxonomy and the idea of the psychological idea of how somebody moves their understanding up that hierarchy. But the Kodenkan idea of transmission of ancient wisdom is very much active learning. It's by teaching your peers, you're learning in a different way than if you're just listening to somebody else and seeing how they demonstrate it and doing it.
And Danzanryu was founded by Henry Okazaki, and his dojo was called the Kodenkan.
Yeah.
And that means School of Ancient Transmission, where the students teach the students, as opposed to a hierarchy where only the head instructor teaches everyone. And that's even on your mat, you have gold belts and green belts teaching white belts.
Sure. And I've had students who had previous martial arts experience asking me questions like, how should I address you? And is it master or this kind of thing? And I'm like, no, it's sensei or Jason is fine, whatever you prefer. And for the moment, this gold belt is going to be teaching you some things. That's the person I want you to pay attention to. Until, so,
one last thing about your school is I would argue the biggest takeaway from that you've had in your training personally that's benefited you is the increase in your STEMI. And in Danzanryu Jiu-Jitsu, STEMI is self-sacrifice, most commonly represented as how we take falls. So when you're doing falls or receiving techniques, someone has to be thrown or have those techniques done to them. And to do that without being injured, you have to be able to STEMI. So no hand, break falls, rolls, back falls, that type of thing would be included in the STEMI canon. How has your STEMI changed teaching 20 brand new white belts every semester?
Yeah, and not just 20 brand new white belts, but we mentioned earlier that I'm 6'3" and 240 pounds. And
you just gained 5 pounds. I like where this is going. It's becoming more and more accurate as we go along.
Yeah, all right. But in any event, I have students as small as gi size 1. So I've had 80-pound, 4'10" students, and one of the core things that I teach every white belt is seonagi, back carry throw, which means that student is going to throw me 180 degrees over the top onto my back. And part of my job is, as they throw me poorly, not to let them collapse and have me come down on them with all my weight and kill them. And I also have to somehow preserve myself to take the next fall. And that has really improved my STEMI. And one other incident that happened was I separated my shoulder in a snowboarding accident in the middle of a semester. And after a few days off, I had to get back on the mat and take STEMIs, and it was my left shoulder. So I had to take STEMI from 20 brand new white belts and not slap on any of those falls. So I think that that's something that it sharpens up your STEMI, especially being a big person. If you want to keep doing this, you have to have a really good STEMI.
Yeah, and you fall down good, so I'd be happy to pay you that compliment. So let's move on to the AJJF. The AJJF, the American Judo and Jiu-Jitsu Federation, which has a board of professors which governs the system. There's a national convention that happens once a year, and during that convention they bring together all of the school heads to make decisions about changing direction, to elect officers, regional managers, and to elect an editor of the Ki-Echo, which is the AJJF's national publication. Tell me about how you decided that was something that you were interested in. What roles have you played with the AJJF?
So, I became aware of the Ki-Echo, back in the 90s when I was working out with Ward and Sand. And I can't remember. I think at that time either Ward was the editor or Dan Browning, also from the Midwest, might have been the editor. I forget what order that came in. But they, made me aware of it and asked me to write an article at one point, which I did. And so I was aware of it in those days. After I came back and had finished my Nidon exam and was getting ready for my Sandan exam, one thing I noticed, because I work in technology, is and because I work in higher ed with a lot of younger people, all of the students are doing everything on their phones. And the way that we were delivering the Ki-Echo was a PDF, which looks great on a computer screen and it prints great, but it doesn't translate very well to a smaller form factor screen. It was definitely the right technology at the time it was adopted, and it had sort of come to a point where this isn't the right way to deliver this anymore if we really want to get young people reading this stuff. So my whole thing about throwing my hat in the ring for the Ki-Echo was, if I do this, I want to transform this into something that's going to be, maintain the nice form factor. I still know that people like print and they like to read something in a beautiful, well-designed format. But how do we also deliver it with a responsive design kind of feeling where it fills up the screen of an iPad, tablet, or a phone or whatever else? And also, with social media having become such a big thing, how do we not just make it once or twice or 3 times a year, one big package of articles, but how do we get more attention by throwing something out there even every few weeks constantly? And so that was my big pitch. I thought if I'm going to do the Ki Echo, it's because I'm going to do this to transform it. I have a strong background in writing, and so the editing and writing is something I can do well too, but that wasn't really what attracted me to it. What attracted me to it was, how do I see my 18 to 22-year-old students actually seeing some of these articles and having their consciousness about this expanded? That's what was exciting for me.
So I really like what you did with the Ki Echo so far, in that a lot of people look at a situation and are happy to bemoan the fact that attendance is down and people aren't necessarily consuming the data that we're putting out and the articles and classes and the conventions. And what you did was saw that it was an opportunity to share with what we have with the technology that people are using today. So what does the Ki Echo look like under your masthead?
So right now, and I'm not done yet. I'm about 2 years in to my first 3-year stint as editor, which might go another 3 years. And I think it's up for election again each 3 years. But so far what I've gotten done is this. I've taken what was a PDF and only a PDF, which is something that is exactly 8.5 by 11. And if you're looking at it on a small screen, you're scrolling all around to try to read it. I've taken that, I've preserved that format, and for the first year, I made every single article a web-based responsive design format. So now you had 2 different ways to read the Ki Echo. You could go to the web page and read it with your phone, or you could download the PDF. In the second year, we changed the workflow somewhat so that I could start releasing each article as it came in, more or less. Go through a vetting process like it used to be the whole magazine did, but much more quickly. And as I posted online, and we use WordPress for our web platform, and Patrick Hedgepath is our web guru, and he helped set things up so that as I would publish that article in the responsive design web format, it would immediately release to Facebook and Twitter. And so we're getting it on social media as soon as it's available. And now I'm going to do an anthology of all the articles that have come out this year into the PDF format, but also we're going to make a printed version of it available to everyone who shows up at convention. And finally, the last pieces of my vision were more multimedia. And so podcasts, and your first podcast is something that we have published as a part of the Ki Echo workflow. So that's a big deal. But the next big frontier is we need to get video out there. We have a YouTube channel that it has one great video on it that was very well, Kimo Williams video, which is really well done and really polished. But that's a couple years old already, and we have not put any new content on there. So we have to figure out next, and this is my next big push, is what's the mechanism to get people to submit videos? What are the standards for the videos? How do we review the videos? And how do we start getting videos published? Because that's another thing that our new cohort, our new group of students are really going to expect, is multimedia.
There's something I'd like to add to that, is that I've been perseverating doing a podcast for several years, and you basically shoved me against my will out of the nest to start releasing them, even though they weren't perfect or ready.
Yeah.
And you didn't want to sit down necessarily and do this interview as a Scandinavian introvert. Yet here we are, because this is the format we're going to need to use to stay relevant outside of the people that are already training, and the occasional weirdo like ourselves wandering into a dojo and sticking around for 10 years.
Yeah, and the other thing is that the other part of social media and YouTube and all this stuff is people know that if they put something out there, they might get criticized for it. And so we have to get past that fear in some way, shape, or form. If you put video of bad techniques out there and you get beat up for it, you can just delete it and it goes away, and it's not the end of the world. Ideally, we have some set of editorial eyes looking at your technique and saying, yeah, that looks pretty reasonably good. Let's get it posted. And if it's not perfect, that's not the end of the world. Perfect is the enemy of complete or finished or successful. I mean, we can't adhere to perfection. It's not ever going to happen.
No, we can't. So how do you see the Ki Echo looking if it stayed on this trajectory with this workflow in a decade?
I would say that the Ki Echo, as it was traditionally, which is a magazine format, would still exist, and it would always be an anthology, and probably a hard copy anthology, a printed, nice, glossy magazine that you could bring with you into the bathroom if you so chose. That
collector's item, I think, is a preferred nomenclature for that.
So that isn't something that I want to see go away. But ideally, the multimedia, the constant written articles, the podcasts, et cetera, would be being released on a regular basis, and that anthology would be more of a, here are the best of articles and pictures from this last year for people who want that collectible magazine, and this is the best stuff that came out this year. But we had lots of really good stuff coming out constantly, and it included lots of multimedia. We have an incredibly visually appealing art that we're doing. We're doing some stuff that looks really, really good. It would be a shame not to be releasing videos of this really beautiful stuff.
And I think part of that fear of criticism is that self-reflection that our technique is never as good as we want it to be.
Sure, and the seeking of perfection and that is important. I mean, that's built right into our DNA in this school. But none of us looking at some of the things that our senseis do are looking at it with that negative editorial eye. We're astounded by how good it looks, and so I think a lot of people would be.
So basically, one of the reasons I asked you to sit down today was a call out to anybody listening to this podcast. If you're a member of the AJJF, please start taking on the responsibility of the Kodenkan, which is to take videos, write articles, participate in this Ki Echo and the sharing of the art that we do with the rest of the community. So anything else you'd like to share, Jason?
Well, I think like everything else, when you step up to these new challenges, it deepens your understanding and your appreciation of the art. And so anytime that you can stretch yourself, that's a big deal. So I've learned a lot by having to really carefully read through all the things that somebody wrote. I'm not just perusing a magazine article now, I'm editing. And that's been really useful to me. We have a lot of great contributors in the people who are contributing stuff right now are doing awesome work, and it's really an honor and a pleasure for me to be able to help them get that idea that, sometimes it's incredibly well written and ready to go, and other times it needs some work, but always the spirit and the sharing that they're attempting to do is very worthwhile.
Excellent. And where can people find your dojo at?
I am at the University of Minnesota Duluth, at the tip of Lake Superior in Minnesota. And my dojo is for UMD students, faculty, staff, and alumni, but I always am welcoming to visiting Uki who might want to jump in with us. And I still am training very much at the Kiryu-no-kan Ward Melanich and Son Wessler's dojo that's been around for 30 years.
Excellent. And then your UMD class has 11 to 12 Tuesday and Thursday club time and 12 to 1 class time on Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Yep.
So if you're at UMD, look up Jason. If you're in Duluth or Minnesota or want to come up to the above warmth between the coasts and do some jiu-jitsu, look us up at the Kiryu-no-kan Duluth Judo Club. And thanks for listening. This has been another episode of True Stories and Other Damage with Jason Davis.